Ambassador Pezzullo, Mr. Swanson, members of the council, guests, and friends, on behalf of the Board of Trustees, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's meeting. It's a religious holiday. The Vienna Boys Choir is here. The mayor is being inaugurated. And the most important event is Mr. Pezzullo's address here this evening. Allow me to thank an anonymous corporate member for this evening's reception. That is, I think, the 6th highest level of charity.
One of the first 5. You owe it to us.
Our next meeting, let me remind you, is on the 6th of January, the 8th annual Baltimore Sun Foreign Policy panel. And I think you'll be pleased with our winter-spring 1988 program. The Office of the Ambassador from China called this afternoon, and he will be joining us in March. And the other acceptances which we have, I think, will be of interest to all of you. Our topic tonight is intriguing: world poverty and United States foreign policy, the public role of private organizations. I'm looking forward to this with, I assure you, great interest, Mr. Ambassador. Our guest is equally interested. He heads, as you know, as Executive Director of the Catholic Relief Services Organization, which is the largest private overseas and development agency in the world. He's a former career Foreign Service officer, entering the service in 1957. He has served overseas in Vietnam, Bolivia, Guatemala, and Colombia. He was the United States Ambassador to Uruguay in 1977, and the American Ambassador to Nicaragua beginning in 1979. He was diplomat in residence at the University of Georgia in 1982, retired from the Foreign Service that in 1982, and has been Executive Director of the Catholic Relief Services since 1983. I won't describe the size or scope or the enormous good work of the organization which he represents, but it combines, as politics at its best can combine, the noblest notions of charity with some very practical political considerations. As I said before, I think the theme is a fascinating one. I'm eager to hear what our guest has to say, so let me introduce with great pleasure Ambassador Lawrence Pezzullo.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by explaining a little bit about what a private volunteer organization is and what they represent in the scheme of things in terms of dealing with the topic. The organizations such as Catholic Relief Service represent an array of systems which extend from the religious community, ecumenical religious community, down through private organizations of all sizes and shapes. Some of them extremely small, and some of them, like Catholic Relief Care, relatively large. All of them grew out of a sense that there was a role to play in getting to the most needy in a very immediate way, not through the red tape that develops many government programs, but in ways down through communities and down to grassroots organizations. Their effect on the institutions that involve themselves in development and relief operations has been enormous. And later on in the evening, I'll touch on some of the things that are done, but I thought you should understand the private sector a bit before I go to the major issue. I think it's fair to say that quite apart from the have somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 million people suffering some form of malnutrition, minor malnutrition all the way down to starvation. And despite the fact that the world community at times reacts to that reality, because you have an ugly remembrance of how terrible famine can be, the impact it has on policy is minor. And the reason, I think, is simple, that nation states see their interests in terms of security, protection of markets, protection of the welfare of their institutions, and less so in terms of the larger issue of poverty or of famine, except when crises strike. The United States is probably somewhat of an exception in that field. And since World War II, we probably were the first leading nation in the world, certainly, to take upon ourselves a role beyond just serving our peculiar and particular self-interest. And we began assistance programs. Marshall Plan was in itself a remarkable bit of diplomacy on the part of the United States, but it went beyond that. And the concern about development, third world issues, became a hallmark of the United States early in the period after World War II. Unfortunately, as I say that, I must also say that since then, the enthusiasm has waned remarkably, and the U.S. is no longer the leader in the field of development or in assistance worldwide. But to go back to that 800 million, and I think it's a figure that's a below reality. It's less than the reality. Most of those people live in what we call the third world, countries that are on the path to development, as they put it, countries that are suffering under one handicap or another to develop the capacity to provide for their citizens the fruits of their own labor. And the effect internally varies depending very much on the circumstances in the individual countries. I'd like to take two recent examples and examine those in terms of public policy as we see it, and then some of the private reaction, and then end up with a few thoughts and then open it for questions. Just 4 years ago, the television sets in your homes showed you some ugly scenes from Ethiopia. And that led to a massive outpouring of sympathy on the part of the American people. And agencies such as my own, and the American government, and other governments around the world were besieged to do something to address this ugly happening. And at the time, there were an estimated 8 million people at risk. What had occurred was that a series of extreme drought years followed one on the other. And I might say that drought in Ethiopia is endemic. But when drought years follow one on another, then it reaches the point where the minimal savings that a small farmer can put aside are eaten up. And slowly the seeds, the bit of extra produce goes, the animals go, and ultimately every bit of hope goes, and they begin either dying or heading to some sort of a small village or city where they have some hope of sustenance. And 84, certainly 83, 84, saw this ugly occurrence really growing in Ethiopia. The United States government was slow to react, primarily because the view the government of Ethiopia as repressive, undemocratic, and brutal, and certainly not representing the will of their people. To add to that, it happens to be the Soviet camp. So the reaction was, at the first wave of concern about Ethiopia, one of reticence to enter. But being the kind of country we are, when public opinion began to demand a reaction, the U.S. reacted very quickly. And it became ultimately the largest donor of assistance to Ethiopia. All the time, very concerned and very critical of the government of Ethiopia. And indeed, the food poured in, and the assistance, the money to go along with it. And whatever number was saved, and the numbers certainly would be counted in the millions, was due in large part to the reaction of the United States government. All during this period, as I say, there was sharp criticism of not only the government structure, but the policies it's following in terms of agriculture and resettlement and villagization in the country. Today, as we talk, Ethiopia is getting ugly again. In 1986, the rains were good. People who had gone back to their farms and had been given tools and seeds and some assurance that there would be food security, because food programs were being kept in place. And I must say, infrastructure within the country had increased to such a point that the confidence level was high. So they returned to their villages, and the crop last year was passable in a country that looked very much like the moon, certainly up in Tigray and Eritrea. And they lived through the period, and there was high hope that perhaps there was a chance for a road back. But this year, unfortunately, the early rains were reasonably good, but the assumption was that they would be followed by good longer rains, which come in the period from July to September. Well, the later rains didn't come. And besides that, you had locusts and other problems. So the needs are great again. And everybody is now beginning to build up their programs on the assumption that as we turn this year, we turn past this year and start moving into 1988, the reduction or the lack of surpluses are going to hit, and people will start to migrate as they did before into the towns. And when that occurs, then we will be faced again with an ugly scene of people dying and all those fitful kinds of emotions that we're driven to. But in Ethiopia, which is a country with endemic problems, the world community and Ethiopia faces a very particular series of problems. The short-term solution, keeping people alive, is possible, but ultimately it's short-term. It's a palliative, needed, and certainly something that should be done with quickness, but the long term is bleak. The policies that the government has adopted for meeting the needs of that country on the agricultural side, on the social side, and certainly on the political side, are such which leave very little hope that you're going to see an improvement. And on the international scene, there is no commitment, and very unlikely will we see a commitment to put in the resources necessary to bring Ethiopia to another stage in its development. So it's a bleak case, and one we're going to live through this year and 3 years from now, and on and on. We now turn to Central America, halfway around the world, completely different set of circumstances. countries that really ecologically have no reason to have hunger, countries that, with the exception of El Salvador, are not overpopulated, but countries, because of another series of circumstances, the failure of governance over a long period of time, the failure of political participation, the failure of equitable distribution of resources. And I'm not talking about stealing from the rich to give to the poor, but I'm talking about something more rational in terms of giving people a sharing of the wealth of the country. And the involvement of outside powers, both East and West, have led to a condition of constant warfare for the last 10 years. And the economic downturn in Central America is truly dramatic in all the countries. The net effect is you've had just heaps of people leaving countries. The refugee exodus is enormous. The displaced is even worse. That's people who leave their homes to move to another part of their own country, to go in with relatives, but to leave the fighting, or to get away from danger. So the human cost is tremendous. The productive loss is almost incalculable. People who have done studies of Central America, which was on a growth curve through the period of the 60s and early 70s, show an alarming turn in that trend. It hasn't leveled off; it's gone down. Every one of the countries has had negative growth beginning in the late 70s, and there's no end in sight. The only end in sight is not one that's going to be brought about by external factors, as far as I can see. The end of anything is going to grow out of what we now are beginning to see is an effort by the very presidents of Central America to take history into their own hands and try to bring about a solution, at least a ceasefire in the beginning of building of some sort of framework within which the societies can deal with their problems. Now let's assume for a moment, and I think it's not a bad assumption, that this peace process will go forward positively. And I don't see for the moment that Washington is doing too much to help it. In fact, Washington is doing everything it can, I believe, to either ignore it or frustrate it. But let's assume that it moves forward. What are we faced with? Well, we're faced with three series of problems having to do with the destitute and the poor, and ultimately with the well-being of that whole region. First of all, we're going to have to deal with the refugees and the displaced. They'll go back home if given half a chance. Just 2 months ago, a group of refugees who were up in Honduras returned to El Salvador. There wasn't big fanfare in the newspapers. It seems that negative news is more exciting than positive news. But these people went home. It was not easy. The Salvadorans considered them subversives. The intelligence services, I'm sure, have all kinds of notations in their files. But because of efforts by a lot of people, they were allowed back. And everything we see thus far is that they've assimilated. They're back in their towns. They're beginning to put their lives together, and hopefully something positive can occur. Now, that was in the middle of warfare. That was before we really saw the effects of the peace agreement. Now, what happens if indeed we have ceasefires in all these countries, but particularly in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and you can get people going back in? The mosquitoes, by the way, have been going back in from Honduras into Nicaragua. We will see a period not only of transporting these people back into their original communities, but a need to keep them there, a need to give them the wherewithal to assist them to be productive again. So that's the first stage of it, and it's going to be enormously expensive. The second stage, which really requires an act of policy initiative is what I would call the period of reinforcing the peace. That is, creating a fund which would create an inducement for the nations individually and in cooperation with one another to build bridges, to develop the capacity to begin working together again. Now, a fund, which would be a fund for peace, could be a fund that the United States could take leadership on, could put out there as an inducement for Nicaragua to reach better records with Honduras, rather than work the other way. To have these reconciliation commissions, which, by the way, are being formed in every one of these countries, and come out of the community, give these reconciliation commissions the capacity to draw from, or projects in the community, so that there would be something out there which would be a clear symbol and a commitment to make the peace effort work. Give it a financial backing. And then third, you've got to look at the long term here. And the long term is going to take as long as it took to destroy those economies, at least 10 years. But getting people comfortable with peace rather than war, with a commitment to agricultural development, maybe even to refiring the Central American common market. But certainly something beyond just the quick and the immediate. And that, to me, is central to this whole issue of what policy do you adopt when you're talking about the question of poverty. It's very easy to throw up your hands and say it's impossible to feed everybody and to make everybody live a good life and to ensure some safety net under all of them. But if you begin approaching it that way, you do nothing. You stand back and say, this is life, there'll always be the poor, and so on, and what the heck can I do about it? The point I'm making is that there are solutions, and Ethiopia is on the downside of that solution curve, and other places like Central America, and you can name others, are on the upside of the curve. But they must have two things. One, the will and the commitment internally in these societies to deal with the problem from a structural point of view and from a policy point of view, so that you're not just trying to cover over the defects, deal with the issue for a short term, but you're really looking for something, substantive change within the societies that make poverty less of a scourge. And secondly, you need the external funding. Without those two, and the same will and commitment to stick with the problem. If you have a blending of these two, you have an opportunity to go forward and reach a solution. Now, let me end simply by saying that poverty is not the kind of issue people like to talk about. And very often when you talk about it, people think, well, here's another do-gooder trying to salve his own conscience. And why don't we look at this in hard-headed terms, in terms of self-interest and the benefits that derive from my country, or to like-minded good people like myself. The fact of the matter is, poverty is a question of self-interest. I think, unfortunately, when we look at world issues, we very often look at it, and some of the people who are most outspoken on world issues see the problems in geostrategic terms, power politics terms, and they see a static world out there. And if you can cut a deal with this one and that one, if we can do it with Gorbachev and a few others, then somehow the world's going to be back in balance. Well, that's nonsense. There's nothing wrong with an agreement with Gorbachev, and there's no reason we shouldn't be looking for balances. But we have to accept that we live in a kinetic world. It changes. And it keeps changing. And leaders change, and leaders fail, and institutions fail. And if you don't accept the fact that there is a need to have something resembling order out there, or at least a search for order, or a search for better solutions to problems, you drive yourself right into cynicism and broken microphone. And cynicism is what leads people to reach for the gun, and reach for the grenade, and reach for the drugs. I'm convinced that you can't make it a simple one-to-one relationship, that poverty and despair leads to crime and violence and political instability. I mean, that's too simplistic. And indeed, many of the people who are the most poverty-stricken are the long sufferers and die without even a whimper. But the point is, there is a relationship between the instability that grows from poverty, that grows from masses of people making demands on governments that can't respond to them, that ultimately has an international repercussion. And it comes slowly. But just look, in our lifetime, older than some and younger than others, I think, in here, how many places we in this country have fought, and how many strange names have emerged in our lifetime of our boys being killed, simply because we never thought that there would be dangers in these places. We live in a very interdependent world. And the fact is that poverty, which is easy to put aside and say, on the argument that that is not strategic, that is not in the U.S. interest. What does it matter whether a couple million starve in Ethiopia? There are too many people there anyway. And plus, they're controlled by the communists and let the Soviets pay. That kind of attitude, it seems to me, what it does fundamentally is start to affect what is very fundamental about us as a people. It is the value system. We just don't think that way. And I think it's significant that Americans don't. And the reason we don't is because we do think that individuals have merit, and that the integrity of people, if you can ever help build it, is worth doing. So I refuse to accept the argument that poverty is a minor issue. It's a minor issue because we don't put the resources there, and because the poor people of the world, as the bishops recently said in one of their pastorals, just don't have the power. Thank you. I'd be glad to take any questions on this issue or anything broader if you'd like to get into it. Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, I didn't hear you touch on what I feel is probably one of the major problems you have. The print in Ethiopia, we read where goods that came in from our sources into Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government would not only not give the trucks, if they give the trucks, they wouldn't let them roll it. Now, something tells me there's a real follow-up from what happens when our goods hit the dependent country we're trying to help. Now, it does seem to me, anything doing to government, your foreign service guys should be on them and straighten that wrinkle out. But would you take that and follow it through? Because, and what percentage of our goods that we give are stolen, sold, and thievery in every nature you can imagine?
Fair enough question. I think you'd be surprised to find out in that communist-controlled country of Ethiopia, cooperation was excellent.
Well, then we read the papers are
let me finish. There is an organization in the government called the Reconstruction, RRC, Reconstruction and Recovery Commission. They within the government were responsible for infrastructure, the moving of goods, the receipt of foreign donations, the allocation of those donations, and so on. Most of the food, talk about food for a moment, that came into Ethiopia in 1984, 86 did not go to the government. Most of it came, especially U.S. food, came through private organizations like Catholic Relief. We received that food at the port. We trucked it to warehouses that we had built. We moved it from warehouses to feeding centers, and then delivered it directly to recipients. The amount of loss was less than we have in most emergency situations. The food that went directly to the government, we can't speak to, because when a country gives food to the government, and the government, in this instance, is free to deliver it to whomever it wants to. The amount of loss in Ethiopia was extremely low, partially because there was no pilferers that we knew of. The only losses we had were due either to rains in areas where grains were not covered yet, or to trucks that went over cliffs or had accidents and the food spoiled en route. But the fact of the matter is that in Ethiopia, if you take Ethiopia as an example, our losses, and we watch our losses very carefully, were less than in most countries. Now let me again say that it's a lot easier to write a story about the pilferage or the loss of commodities than it is to look at the other side of it. In one year in Ethiopia, Catholic Relief Agency and its partner agencies, which include Lutheran World Relief, the McKinney Jesus Church, which is a local Lutheran church, the local Catholic Church, and some of our other partners, and there were 20 of them, which included the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, other Protestant groups, at least 20 other small institutions, internationally known in this country and abroad. They distributed in 1 year 225,000 tons of food directly to recipients. Directly. The losses were minimal. As I say, that side of the story is less dramatic than the other. In every one of these cases, there are losses. When you move food through any of these primitive countries, you find that the port facilities are poor. Port to wherever you're going are poor. We go over roads you wouldn't even recognize as a road. So the breakdown of trucks is enormous. The maintenance of trucks is a horror. Losses en route are horror. We just about a month ago, we had 7 of our trucks fired on by the rebels in Tigray. They burned 7 of our trucks and 49 tons of food, and then they said they were sorry. Well, I'm sure they're having a war. I didn't even mention that in Ethiopia, but you got 2 wars going on at the same time in the middle of all of this. And I don't think they attacked us because of any evil intent. I'm just pointing out that when you deal in these countries where emergencies reach a stage where you call them emergencies, you're talking about horrendous problems just getting food delivered to anybody.
I just wanted to make a comment. My name is Margaret Stan, and I'm the Archdiocese Director of Catholic Relief. My concerns are the same as yours. So in 1986, I was voted in Ethiopia and received these things that Mr. Pezzullo was talking about. You would be amazed at the kind of charts that people have to keep on all of the food that comes in, because it is audited by our United States government to make sure that it is going to people. The kinds of verification that they have to have for it, and the tremendous difficulty getting it around. When you hear people saying that people who want food, when you think about a place where their roads are so bad. One day, we took a ride 4 hours from the place where food was shipwrecked down to Masala, which was the port where they came from the ship. That was a 4-hour ride down the mountain with half-day turns and trucks, convoys of trucks that 4 hours down to pick it up and 4 hours back. were provided by the government, took us from point to point where we could actually check things. I wish you could say, because you would have that question, how food things should be.
I did not plant this woman in the audience. Yes, I'm sorry.
Share us an example where food policy has worked over a period of years. Can you perhaps give us an example that I have in mind? India, where there's a situation that's improving tremendously over, say, the past 10 or 20 years, so it's far from being solved. Think of a better example.
Well, food policy
Could you repeat your question?
the issue is, can I talk to one issue or one case where food policy has had a sufficient time being in place to show results? Food policy is a problematic area for the simple reason that, and we've been involved in food distribution ever since the food PL 480 program was initiated. And let me just touch on some of them because I think you should understand them. Most of our food programs, 90% of them, forget emergencies for a moment, are what we call child-mother nutritional programs. And the purpose of that is you can't feed, no matter what they can feed, you can't feed everybody nor would you want to. So you take the most vulnerable element in the society, young children before the age of 5, pregnant women, and certainly the mothers of those children. And you try, in a real sense, to put in place a preventive system. You try to give them a nutritional supplement so that the malnutrition of the children does not get so low that it seriously affects their growth pattern. And people who've looked at this, and I don't count among myself among nutritionalists, will tell you that if you give some strength during those first 5 years, there is a chance of the child surviving, or the survival rate is much higher. After 5, they leave. And actually, these things keep rotating through. When you try to sit down, and we put an awful lot of effort into keeping records, because it's very important for the mother who comes to these stations to have some sense that the food is doing something for their child. So each month when they come in, they're weighed, they're measured, and the mother senses, and we sense, whether or not that child is using the food we gave them, and whether or not the problem is more serious. We also teach nutritional classes then, teach the mothers how to take the food and enrich it by usually local products, adding some local additive that adds the nutrition. Now, you can have these records in place for this group of children and mothers going through a course, and then they leave the course. And then another group keeps coming in. What happens after 10 years or 15 years? We don't have the capacity to measure. We're not scientists. We're not sitting around following these people over 10, 15, 20 years to see what the effect has been as compared to another group that didn't receive food and nutritional supplements. We would love if universities, and I've gone to many of them, if universities would pick up that aspect of it. We'll take care of the operational side, but we would like to have someone look at the statistical side. Just what do we know about the long-term effect of food? The fact of the matter is, some people will tell you they see all kinds of great contributions here. I still am skeptical myself that we know enough. So food programs are problematic. A, you just don't know what the long-term effect will be. B, you do not want to make them dependent on food that you're bringing in and somehow cut them out from dependence on their own internal needs. 3, you do not want to substitute foods that they would buy from local producers and negatively affect the local producer. And that you can do. So food programs are touchy. They're tough to analyze. They're effective it, as I say, in those areas where you're at least trying to build up the nutritional strength of young people, young children, and during emergencies, well, they're life-saving.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. It's a joy to find out that we have an ambassador who's speaking that down to put the human need rather put defense for strong security, weapons of death, and you're doing a marvelous work. In other words, if we, the American government, would be more alert to poverty in the world, would this alleviate our tax money going to support Central America, the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, anywhere else in the world?
Well, I think you heard the question. If we were putting more money into food programs and helping the poor with this substitute for the military programs we have to engage in, and the military hardware and the big military we have to maintain. I think the easy answer would be yes. The fact is, I think you've got to do both. I think there are societies out there in the world that we're going to have to be guarded against. I think the United States has taken on a major responsibility since World War II in the defense area. I think we can maintain that and fulfill it without becoming obsessive about it. What I see as the problem in our country, on the policy level, where you're arguing for resources, budgetary policy level, is that the security argument is so much stronger than the development argument. You sound like a soft head when you talk about development, and you sound like a tough macho guy when you're talking about security. And the reason is, people get frightened about security, and they don't get frightened about poverty. That's simple. And most of the defense arguments are based upon fear. Now, some of it is real fear. I mean, I'm not saying we live in a world where if we disarm, suddenly paradise would ensue. Not at all. There is a need for security. There is a need for preparedness. There is a need to be alert. However, the argument for putting resources into that camp are so much easier to make. We have an institution around. As Eisenhower said in his last days in the presidency, beware of the military, the industrial complex. And he was not speaking as a pacifist. I mean, the man spent his whole life in the armed forces. But the point is, there is a community of arguments you can make there that appeal to the American people who are concerned about or fearful of things out there that you can't make in getting them to put $300 billion into assistance program. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like you to say something about giving technical assistance in relation to food as opposed to just giving food. And what makes me ask the question is the expression, give a man a fish and he can eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he can eat for a lifetime.
Yeah. I think I probably the question was, can I address the technical aspects of helping people develop in the development area rather than just concentrate on providing food. And she
in other words, they can provide their own.
Yes, and she mentioned the old adage about give a man a fish and he eats one day, teach him to fish and he eats fish forever. The point is well taken, that I concentrated in focusing this thing because you can't cover the waterfront on emergency kinds of reactions to poverty. I touched a little bit on the Central American side on the longer-term development aspects. There's no question. Food is a short-term, especially in starvation situations, a short-term needed input. In the long term, there is no substitute for people doing for themselves. And it's an art form to know how you can design a program where you're doing just enough. It's like raising a child. You're doing just enough to get them to the takeoff stage so that they go off on their own, and not beyond that. And therein lies one of the greatest areas of difficulty, because people in my own organization fall in love with their own project. You can see them, they're so enamored by it. And if you say, well, can't you change it a bit? They get very nervous. But it's very important to keep in mind that what you're doing with people who you are trying to assist is not becoming, as I would put it, becoming another colonialist.
Or work yourself out of a job.
Well, work yourself out of a job is the best way to put it, but you got to be careful that you don't become ego involved and you're looking for some sort of approval and applause. Every time I get applauded, unfortunately, when you go around the world and you see some of these desperate people, the minute you walk in, they want to applaud you. And it always embarrasses me because that's the wrong emotion. I don't want to see applause. I want them to ignore me. But it's endemic in the issue. Yes.
I want to go back to the first question about the thievery of the supplies, running the nutrition reports. We had the lady say everything's accounted.
Yeah.
That's actually nonsense. They're saying that it's minimal. We're talking about littering generalities. We've seen the pictures, and it hurts to see who America sends over there not being delivered. And we hear about trucks not being there. Trucks can't get through. And we hear about the Ethiopian government buying weapons with their civil war. Eritrea. It's kind of a mess. I mean, how long can you come to the American people and say, we've got to feed these people when the Ethiopian government themselves are spending their resources for arms? And I don't think you can address these questions. I charge you for
I'm not going to convince you. And no words I say are going to convince you. I mean, if you're going to sit there and assume that something you heard or read is the truth, what that woman said there just a moment ago is the absolute truth. Every pound of food we sign for, we're responsible for. And we have to account for it to the U.S. government. You have not dealt with the U.S. government if you speak that way. The fact is, it's got to be accounted for. If it's not delivered, you have to show why not. If it's lost, you have to file reports as to why it was lost and why it was lost. If it rotted or was infected with flies or with any other material, you have to have it inspected and shown that it was inspected. We've been working at this for the last 35 years. I don't have to sit here and defend my organization or a lot of other organizations that are in the field. It's a public record. Losses occur, I said that. Of course they occur. Dealing in Ethiopia is not dealing in Connecticut. You're dealing in a communist country with 2 civil wars going on at the same time, with all kinds of logistical problems, with people in desperate conditions. And of course it's difficult to work there. I don't think I understated the difficulty. But we performed. And those who were there, including the representatives of the UN, including representatives of our government and other donor governments who are responsive to their own citizens, were perfectly pleased with performance. So that's about as much as I can say. If you want to go beyond that, I think that what you should do to satisfy yourself is make a trip to one of these countries. And we'd be perfectly willing to show you our distribution works and how we operate our program. Yeah.
How effective is the United Nations in dealing with these food problems?
Well, the United Nations has several institutions. The question was, how effective is the United Nations in dealing with these problems? The United Nations has several entities that operate in the field of development and emergency work. Let me just touch first on the emergency area. In most of your major emergencies, whether it be Cambodia or Ethiopia or Central America, you will find a UN entity. Now, if it's a refugee problem, which is what we had in Cambodia and now Thailand, one of the major entities is the UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees. And that is a internationally funded organization with headquarters in Geneva, with offices naturally in the area where the problem occurs, that in the case of refugees, does the actual registry, keeps those records. Organizations like Catholic Relief and other organizations work in the camps, providing whatever it is, health services or food services or whatever the particular contract is. The UN acts as the basic administrator and then tries to get countries to pledge for receipt of these people. In cases like Ethiopia, it became such an enormous issue of coordinating. There were so many organizations in there, so many countries involved, that they sent a special representative who set up a fairly large-scale operation and was overseeing just the thing we were talking about, the infrastructure problem, the coordination between the various entities, the performance of the local government, and then reporting back to the UN and publicly. And by the way, that gentleman made, the UN representative in Ethiopia, made an extremely good report 2 years ago. And he considered the Ethiopian emergency, well, it was the largest humanitarian relief effort in the history of man, and he called it a glowing success. So they will play a different role in different circumstances. They then have a lot of other entities like the World Health Organization and a small development organization, UNDP, and other institutions. Yes.
Let me just start out with a comment. A very close friend of mine, has been with USAID for 25 years and was sent to Ethiopia to be one of the overseers of the distribution, and he was mightily impressed with how efficiently things were gotten out, rather than reporting what you're saying about it. But my question was about Catholic Relief. Do you ever have difficulty moving into a country to help a country because it's called Catholic Relief, or simply because you're a charity organization?
Well, the interesting thing is, most of our programs are in non-Christian countries. In fact, I just came from Morocco a month ago. We're the only American private organization in Morocco, Muslim country, and we're considered marvelous. I mean, they treat us like VIPs over there, and we're just getting into a fairly large program. We're enlarging the program. We're in India. We've been in India for years. We're in Thailand. We're in Indonesia. We're through the whole North Africa. We're in Gaza Strip. We're in Lebanon. We're one of the few organizations in Lebanon. So the Catholic issue does not come up once in a while, but rarely. There's confusion as to whether or not we're a missionary organization because it does say Catholic Relief. Most of our people are lay people. We do have some priests and we have some nuns. We have people of other religions, other faiths. I would suspect out there somewhere there are people who wouldn't want us around because they think we're proselytizing. We make it we're very firm on that. And we're in an organization which is an ecumenical organization, which is not an operational organization at all. It's called the Interfaith Hunger Appeal, which is made up of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, Lutheran Relief Services, and Church World Services. And we constantly talk about the fact that none of our programs have any religious content. We are, all of us, the Jews, the Protestants, and the Catholics, all saying that we feel the reason we're doing it comes out of our great concern about the individual and the sanctity of the person. don't hide the fact that we call ourselves Catholic Relief Services, call ourselves something else. I don't think the bishops would like it. But it's there probably, and every once in a while you do sense that that there may be a door closed, but not enough to really concern us.
Mr. Ambassador, I've been coming to the council long enough to remember times when we used to compare the current administration's policies to the previous administration's policies. And of course, it's been a long time, and we may have forgotten the previous administration. We also have my belief is that the current administration makes policy many times on the basis of anecdote. They've been charged with that in the case of the welfare mother in Chicago, who was evidently a notorious cheat, and therefore we should do away with welfare programs. Possibly there's been an implication tonight that we have an anecdote where some goods didn't get delivered, and maybe we should do away with programs which give food as opposed to arms. Do you have any statistics which compare the previous administration with the current administration on food versus arms, or humanitarian versus arms aid to other countries?
Let me see if my memory is good. John Swenson might be able to help. Last year there was as I recall, $15 billion sought for assistance program. Of that $15 billion, about half of it went to two countries. Went to Israel and Egypt. Of the remaining $7.5 billion, at least half went into what is called economic security program. What's that fund called, John? ESF. ESF are monies that are given to the country for a whole variety of things, including basis agreements. And I hold myself guilty for part of that because I negotiated the basis agreement with Spain in 1974, and we put some of that money in. Anyway, the money, that other $7.5 billion has maybe half of it made up of commitments, either on the basis agreements or other agreements. So you end up with, what would the figure be, John, for development assistance and food programs? $3.5 million? You're talking about $2.5 billion. Now that figure, I don't think has changed materially in the last 10 years. The emphasis put on assistance prior to this administration were greater. The budgetary commitments were not all that much greater. The big difference has been, if you talk to congressmen, I'm sorry we don't have somebody like Congressman Obey from the Appropriation Committee. What Obey would tell you is that what past administrations did is they'd come up with a budget for assistance and they'd fight for it. What this administration has done is gone up with a budget and then not fought for it. So the net effect is they put the onus on the Congress to appropriate and argue for the funds. And in the budget crunches we've had in the past years, a lot of congressmen are saying, if you don't want to carry the water, if you don't want to pay the price up here politically, we're not going to carry it. So you've had a funny situation developing in the U.S. government where the principal supporters of foreign assistance have been saying the heck with it. The net effect is foreign assistance gets hurt. But the amount of foreign assistance has been relatively minor. Now, if you put that figure that I just used, and you compare it to what's happened to the defense budget in the last 8 years, the defense budget went from $100 if I recall correctly, about 125 to 130 billion to 330 between 1981 and 88, 87. So you're talking about a 200% increase in defense expenditures. And, you know, foreign assistance was such peanuts that even if it went up and down a little bit, it was minor. The fact of the matter, and it's a true fact, is that foreign assistance, which you'll hear people in government and in Congress say is very important for this country, for its long-term security and self-interest, is not a program that gets all that much support. And you'd have to go back in time to find anybody who gets up on the floor and fights it. It just is not, as I said before, it's a lot easier to sell programs which have to do with people's fears about their security than about programs where we're wasting food that rots on docks and gets stolen. And yet you're talking about a minute portion of the federal budget.
Can you contrast Ethiopia's problems with other countries in Africa which have similar climatic situations?
Well, the difference is Ethiopia is a big country and very heavily populated. Ethiopia has 45 million people. Look at it on a map someday. It's an enormous piece of real estate. You're talking about a country the size of the northeastern part of the United States. It's a big piece of country. The northern part, which are the Eritrea and Tigray, which are the conflict areas, have been so denuded, not by this government and not by the government before it, but over the last 30, 40, maybe 100 years, that it looks as if somebody went with a razor over it, cut everything down. There's not a tree, a twig, or anything. And that used to be forest land. It's man that did it. I mean, this was not some ecological disaster that came from beyond. It was man who burnt everything in sight. They're still burning everything in sight. They only cook with firewood. And they'll pick up pieces of firewood if they have to walk 40 kilometers for it. One of the terribly difficult things to deal with in a place like Ethiopia is how the heck do you find a substitute for firewood? What do? They want to cook on an open grill.
Roll out newspaper.
We've introduced stoves that are more economical. They use them, but my goodness, when you see millions of people in a barren, desolate landscape with little twigs here and there, I mean, it's worse than the locust. One more? Yeah.
I'm just curious. This is a very detailed question compared to the ones you've been receiving. What exactly kind of food do you send? Is it all canned goods? You talk about it spoiling, so that must indicate there's a lot of fresh stuff. So I'm just curious, what is the composition of food? Is there any place I could read something about this? I'd like to know just what they do.
Sure. No, the foods are basic foods. They're bulgur wheat. There's a composition food made up of various grains, oil, powdered milk. And they're usually constituted so that they provide a reasonable diet. In some places, we try very hard to buy local produce. For example, Ethiopia, they produce a grain called teff, which is a very tiny little grain, high in protein, which they like very much. They don't produce much of it. It's a very poor producer. So even in the middle of these emergencies, if you can buy locally, because you find odd things right in the middle of a drought and a desperate need for food, you can go 60 kilometers away from someplace and find food, because there are no distribution systems. These countries, as part of the underdevelopment, the market system is so bad that they don't distribute. They don't know how to market, they don't know how to preserve, and we try as much as we can to buy local farm produce and move it from one area to another. But to answer your question, these are basic U.S. surplus commodities. That's how the program began in 1964. It grew out of the farm surplus is growing like mountains, and secondly, some inventive people who said, well, let's take it and use it for a good purpose. And those two things were blended, and the PL 480 legislation was brought with the result. So some farm surpluses, the farmers get paid for the grains, so they're very supportive of the program. The millers who mill it get paid. The shippers who ship it get paid. It has to be shipped on American bottoms, which cost more than other bottoms. So there's a whole constituency there that is very supportive of food programs. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take advantage of my role as moderator and ask one more question. The reason I do so is that we've had a lot of discussions over the period of the last several years about the current administration's policy toward Nicaragua. Of course, the ambassador served during a uniquely interesting period, the last couple of years of the Carter administration's, the Carter administration. One of the most basic claims made by the current administration is that the Carter administration made a genuine effort to support and work with and aid the Sandinista regime. And that only after the Sandinista regime was extraordinarily uncooperative and demonstrated clearly that aid didn't make us their friend, even the Carter administration was inclined to dismiss the Sandinistas' claims for cooperation, to see them instead as a regime allied with perhaps the Soviet Union, at least deeply uncooperative. But the current administration makes that as a pivotal part of their current foreign policy position. You were the American ambassador in Nicaragua during those years. Would you comment for our edification upon those first years of attempting to cooperate with the Sandinistas and on the current administration's portrayal of those years?
That's another presentation. Well, I hope you can bear with me. I can't answer this easily, quickly, and I have to take a little time. Remember that the precursor to the entry into power of this administration was another administration that had been in power for 43 years and had worn itself out and worn out its welcome. And that welcome began to be worn out in 1972-73 when the earthquake struck Managua. And the principal reason that event turned the Nicaraguan people against Somoza was because up until then, Somoza, even though he was a 5% type of crook, was not affecting people desperately. That is to say, there was enough prosperity in the country that people could pay that 5% because that was the cost of doing business. But when your capital city goes, and I don't think it's easy to comprehend a capital city going, but that's what happened in Nicaragua. The countryside was fine. Managua disappeared. And with it went the whole banking system, the business and commerce was crippled. And that sector, that business commercial sector, which was paying the 5% and not liking it much, but not complaining much either, realized within almost no time at all that Somoza would never bring that country back. That Somoza was going to steal them blind right in the middle of a national disaster, and that their country and their destiny was going to be hurt. No question, they felt. They were the first and most vocal and most vociferous and the most insistent to us in 1972-73 that Somoza should get out. And I remember this because I went down there. I was down there in 72 before the earthquake, and I was down in 73 right after the earthquake. And the private sector told us just that. And I remember reporting that back in Washington, and the Nixon administration didn't want to hear that. Nixon administration, of all the the administrations we've had since Somoza came to power, the original Somoza in 1933 was the only American administration that supported Somoza. That's a very important historic fact. So, that event, 72, 73, set in train a conspiracy against Somoza, and it began among the political parties, members of the church, and the private sector, which was more important than anything. That began to create an environment which was corrosive and ultimately reached a point in 78, 79 where you couldn't contain it anymore. Somoza was, when I went in there in June of 1979 with a full-fledged civil war going on, all that Somoza had left was people, some remnants of the National Guard. Everything had fallen away. Even our support had fallen away. Even the support of his neighbors had fallen away. He was completely isolated. And we did, and it was the credit of the Carter administration, we did get him out. We got him out. That was my job. Went in there, and in 3 weeks we got him out, and we stopped the war. But the history of the U.S. in Central America, and specifically in Nicaragua, and I'm not talking about the pamphleteers who want to make it worse than it seems, was pretty bad. I mean, we were always supporting the vested interest without any sense of the larger society. So our reputation in Nicaragua was not good. Those who came in were revolutionaries. These are mostly the sons and daughters of those private sector people who turned on Somoza in 72. You look at the leadership of the Sandinistas and you'll find many of the sons and daughters of those small businessmen, small commercial people who heard this around the dinner table when they were 12, 13 years old, and began to be runners for the Nicaraguans, for the Sandinistas when they were 14. I know my daughter-in-law is one of them. Every family in Nicaragua was involved in this, all of them. So when Somoza went, and these young boys came in, and women, a lot of women, and were going to remake their country, the United States, to them, was the personification of the devil, because we were seen as the supporter of Somoza. The only good thing, and they will not admit to this day, that they could not deny, was that we ended the war. The Sandinistas today, if you ask them, they say they defeated Somoza. Now that's true to some extent. They would have lost another 15,000 people at least if they had to take Somoza. The United States of America got Somoza out. The fact of the matter is they never forgot that. And there was always a grudging acceptance of that reality, that the United States did, at the moment of truth, perform. But there was a sense, a bitterness toward us. It went through many layers of their group. Revolutions are disorderly things. Revolutions have different ways with people. They've got polemicists and opportunists and charlatans and everybody. And we were trying to develop a relationship. And we had no options. The only option we had was to say, we'll help you get back on your feet again. Now, this is not popular among some of the conservatives in Washington who say we should have turned our back on them. I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong now, and they were wrong then. But we did the right thing. We went in, we gave them their first assistance in money, and then we fought and gave them $75 million in that very same assistance I was talking about, ESF funds, which are the most fluid and the most easily usable. But there were a lot of other circumstances at play. Central America was in turmoil. Salvador was in war. They had a unfortunate, and they still have it to some extent, an obsession with the fact that they were going to be the revolutionary leadership of Central America, which was nonsense. They couldn't even govern their own country. In fact, they still are not learning how to govern their own country too well. But they thought of themselves as playing on the world stage and dealing with the North Koreans, and dealing with the PLO, dealing with the Soviets. And you can't fault them with that. It is their country. But they wasted an awful lot of their effort trying to play in a league they didn't have the capacity to play in. And that made it very difficult to build a relationship, especially in that they came in 1979, and 1980 was an American election year. The conservatives in this country began tormenting this policy from the beginning. The Republican platform of 1980 said we have to throw out the Sandinistas for power. Now, this is a platform of American political party at a period when you're trying to develop a new relationship with people who have no faith in us to begin with. All they do is read the platform, or they read the Santa Fe documents that came out of a bunch of conservative Republicans who wrote a bunch of papers that really read like some sort of maniacal music. So here you are with a revolutionary group of people who have these weird ideas of where they're going and what your relationship is. They assume you're CIA, and you're trying to undercut them every day of the week. I lost my temper more times than I can tell you, because I was coming up to Washington almost every month fighting on the Hill for $75 million. And I'd go back there, and every day they had one stupidity after another in the newspaper. And I said, go roaring in saying, you people are crazy. If you don't want the blast at $75 million, fine. But you can't do this. You can't be calling people names in Washington and calling us names every day in the press and doing all these silly things and assuming that we're going to give you $75 million. Well, plus the campaign, which was anti-Sandinista. Well, what happened is what you'd expect to happen. Whatever policy, whatever virtue there was in the policy. And I would say today, if it happened again, we should do that same darn thing. But we should have the grit and the courage to stick with it. And stick with it not for 6 months or a year, but stick with it. But we couldn't do that. We had a change in government. The new government came in, and they were going to go the covert way. They were going to start the military program that they began. They picked up an activity that the Argentines had begun before them, and it sort of just got out of hand, and now it's the Contra movement. And they act as if this is a finely wound or finely made Swiss watch. It's a disaster. And it stands now as a policy which we all sit around and argue as if it's something that normal, sane people talk about. So I can't answer your question other than to say, if you live in a world of lunacy, you act like a lunatic. If a group of people come into power for whatever stupid reason, and the United States doesn't have the capacity, the diplomatic skill, the courage, to have a relationship with them. There are 2.5 million people. That's less people than are in the Bronx where I grew up. I understood revolution. I grew up in it, for goodness sake. So if we don't have that courage, all these other issues are minor. They don't mean anything. I know. The things I read in the press, half of them just get me livid. They're done by people who have no courage, who have no sense of where we are as a people, who know nothing about Central America, care less. So there's your answer.
Ambassador.